All right. So we are live today with a good buddy of mine, Greg. Got to catch up with him over dinner a few weeks ago and really got to, know about his story. And it was just a really interesting story about career pivots. A lot of us get into this space one way or the other, and it's oftentimes not one clear path. You could, become an attorney, you could, go to business school, you could be a rocket scientist, and really pivot your career into any industry that you want to get into. So spend some time with Greg, and what's really interesting about his story is he's pivoted his career a couple times, similar to how I have. Right, he started in the legal industry and then kind of pivoted into private equity, and now he's working with ultra high net worth individuals, and collaborating with them and building communities and building networks. And that's how we met through another close friend that just has been able to curate amazing communities of institutional investors. So Greg, number one, welcome to the show. Number two, excited to see you again later tonight to
Yeah, thanks
talk
for having
talk
me,
more
Joe.
more about this. So I'm really privileged to have a seasoned private equity professional like Greg come in and share his story. So Greg, why don't you kind of tell us a little more? We got plenty of time, so tell us a
Yeah.
little more about your career, your background. You got pretty much got a free ride, to law school, so that was a unique story as well. But why don't we start with, your early childhood, what you thought you wanted to do, and how that evolved over time, and how that complemented your ambition to just kind of continue growing in your career.
Well, geez, we're going back deep though. Okay, so a story that probably doesn't get shared too often, but I think my first foray into private equity and private finance was I was in a club. It was called FBLA, it's Future Business Leaders of America, which oddly was the smaller group of what was called DECA, which is very big for marketing. If some of your people in your audience are familiar with that, and that really kind of gave me like the entrepreneur bug. I came in second actually for New Jersey's like Mr. FBLA, and I didn't really understand how, but it was cool. I got involved, which kind of helping like do small businesses, involved with the community. One of the things I actually started when I was 15, 16 was actually doing basically like, you know, computer repair work, right? Back in the day when Geek Squad, for everybody who remembers that, was just kind of starting off. I was kind of like a competitor for them locally. I mean, it was just kind of, you know, helping friends and, friends' families fix their computers and set up their IT stuff. Really didn't think there was much of a business before. Just kind of helping add value, which would be a theme of my career. But one of my friends' mothers gave me like $200 for like an hour and a half worth of work, which, when you're in high school is a ton of money.
Oh
And
yeah.
then I went and did work for somebody else, wasn't even expecting anything. It was more of a favor. And she gave me like another 150, $200. And I'm like, I think I've got like a business here. Like, it was just very weird. And, I asked two of my friends to help me because I was getting a little bit of a following within the local community. And one of my friends, who was a really good programmer, was almost laughing at it because he was like, there's no way people are paying us for this, because he was very advanced, far beyond me. He didn't have a lot of great human social skills, but he's
Hmm.
like, there's no way somebody's paying us a couple $100 an hour just to get this stuff done. And I'm like, well, that's the going rate. I mean, I never really set the price. This is what they offered, and we're solving a need, and they don't know how to fix it. So that kind of really stuck with me. I probably didn't know how prescient that comment was back in the day, but that really got me into focusing on that. I tried to do a couple tech ventures, which I wasn't so great at, but I mean, I think that was kind of the first step into entrepreneurship. I went to Monmouth University and got an undergraduate degree in business and finance. Didn't really know a whole heck of a lot about finance, but was able to sync up with an individual who took a number of companies public for a couple $1 billion back in the early 90s, really true venture capitalist. I was a runner at Mama. The sports injury kind of got me into this weird world of private equity and venture capital. But I was fortunate to just really kind of learn through osmosis through some really big guys who made a lot of money back in the 80s and 90s and created a lot of value for their shareholders. And that kind of really started me into that venture capital space, working with some medical device, software technology, telecom businesses, just kind of really learning the industry. Again, very fortunate that I got to work on some projects that probably at the time a 27, 28-year-old who's gone to business school should have been working on. And then I mentioned to you, when I was working on a couple of larger transactions, and we were looking for some institutional capital for some venture capital funds, I started to realize that a lot of the managing partners had law degrees. They weren't lawyers, but they had law degrees. And thinking I was already working on some high finance business, I didn't really think an MBA would be the most prudent use of my time. I didn't really come from a financial family per se. My mom was an aide for special needs kids. My dad was military. And I was just kind of like, I got to figure out what more of this is about. And long story short, I applied to about 30 different law schools. I figured, getting a law degree would really help me evaluate deals and know how to structure transactions. I was also working with a number of family offices at the time who were allocating, and they were asking me very technical questions. So much like how curating this community that we're talking about, I would ask my friends who are CPAs and attorneys and say, hey, can you give me some advice here and make me look good? And then maybe you can get a new client for your practice. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but, just trying to build the ecosystem. But yeah, ended up going to law school, really focusing on taxation and partnerships, entity structuring, things that were kind of near and dear to the ultra high net worth and deal making community. And that kind of really put me on a different trajectory, so to speak, where I just became a little bit more than a deal raiser or a deal maker and a capital raiser, but also just trying to help, deal guys and family offices make sense of their life. And, that's kind of what I've been doing, for lack of a better word, for the last 5 to 6 years. I can kind of get some other iterations, but that, I guess, it took me from 16 to 24, so to speak. I'm happy to drill down into anything there.
Sure. I mean, one thing that I would maybe hammer down on is just the mistakes that connectors make. So when you're trying to connect deal makers to allocators, a big mistake I see, and I always like this phrase, but you don't want to feed a steak to a vegan, right? If somebody likes climate, they may not be looking at AI deals. So kind of curating and personalizing opportunities to appropriate people that are looking for those opportunities. I feel like that's a common mistake that, community builders are making, where they're just not kind of appropriately connecting people to what they're really interested in. And then people just actually drop off because they're not interested. But I don't know if you have any other examples of just kind of.
I would say, though, the worst would be, and this is going to be a little bit of a terse analogy, but feeding a filet mignon to a starving hyena.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is I had a situation where very wealthy family had a very certain look for what they wanted, got introduced to a sponsor through a friend, didn't particularly like the vertical that they were in, but he actually had something that this one family wanted. I gave the sponsor ample time to tell them how to address the family, what their pain points were, how this could, in more ways than one, be a really good rifle shot slam dunk. I mean, it was just kind of, they had what the family was looking for, right?
Sure.
Sponsor couldn't get out of their own way by simple deal structures. Family, despite amassing a significant amount of wealth, not very up and up on the typical private equity lingo, which common theme is if families don't understand things, they won't tell you that. They're just going to get shy and just lose interest. So
Sure.
You have the sponsor coming in with these high technical terms. It wasn't that the family was unsophisticated. They just didn't know the lingo. It's not their world.
Yeah.
So that kind of turned them off. And then when the sponsor realized that they weren't going to get this particular deal done with them, which in all intents and purposes, they really should have been able to do so, they pivoted to 4 other deals that had zero interest to the family. The sponsor just thinking, well, the family had a lot of money and clearly they'll just take a look at anything they want to do. Sponsor not really recognizing that they, one, couldn't deliver on the first thing that they wanted, and then two, really never had the trust built up with the family.
Sure.
So then the family comes back to me and is basically in no uncertain words like, what's up with this guy? Why is he still contacting me? Which in turn, as a connector, as somebody who's just trying to be a facilitator, as somebody who's already gained the trust, it tends to make you look not so valuable. Now, in this situation, I did things for the family that provided tremendous value, so I wasn't too aware of it. But if it was a family who I had not a solid foundation with, you can quickly burn a bridge there too, right? Because then all of a sudden you become, unreliable or just not valuable to them anymore. So that's something that I think everybody needs to be cognizant of, even people with the best intentions. And listen, the sponsor is a great individual, but at the same point, wasn't very coachable. I think is ultimately what it came down to, or for whatever reason, didn't think what I was telling them was true. And you'll see a common theme when you're working with family offices. Some people tell you they work with family offices. Oh, I've done deals with this family, that family. We've looked at this stuff together. And then the talk track, you kind of realize that they've never actually done a deal with the family office because they don't know how to approach them. They don't know how to make the alignment properly. And quite candidly, they don't know when to say, listen, this deal isn't a fit for you. Right? Like, I'm working on this. It's a great opportunity, but it doesn't align with anything that you want. And you pick that up, right? And then I think you want to make sure you're working with individuals who get that too when you're making those introductions.
I would say too, a big tool that I've seen sponsors and managers use is just the concept of education. So if there's these very sophisticated terms, just kind of integrate in some of that education around those terms within the presentation. That way the family kind of gets that knowledge or that knowledge transfer, throughout the process. So do you feel like that? I mean, obviously this person wasn't coachable at all, but have you seen managers and sponsors kind of use that to kind of break the ice and, help LPs and allocators just kind of learn about sectors?
The good ones do.
Yeah.
I mean, right. I mean, the good ones really, but it's funny. So when I see different, presentations or pitches or however you want to look at it, there's such an institutionalized process around what information is out there. It's like, oh, you have to show, what the IRR is and sensitivity analysis. And I do think if you're talking about specifically going to family office capital and allocators, there's a much different approach to a fifth or sixth gen family versus a first or second gen family.
Sure.
A lot of the first and second gen families are very much like dollar in, dollar out. In at least what I've come across, where they get simple concepts. They've been laser focused on a business for 10 to 35 years. They know that industry inside and out. But if you can't explain to them in very simple terms what you're doing in your business transaction, they get turned off pretty quickly because they tend to think that you're not a professional because they can explain their industry like you would to a 4-year-old child, and the child would get it. And if you can't do that, where you're supposed to be an expert, well, then you're not on the same playing field, right? Sure. And I think that's a big thing. So just throwing around IRRs and DPIs and things like that, they don't get the lingo. But if, they do get the idea of MOIC, I think, very quickly, because it's just your multiple on capital. You put $1 in, you get 3 out. But I do think when you're getting into things that are more nuanced, I mean, I've been working with a friendship with a gentleman who's a music royalty expert, and he's done a tremendous amount of work there as an operator and sponsor. But I constantly have had to stress to him, they don't know what you know. So educate the families on what they need to know and why this makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, they're just taking a look at what everything like BlackRock and, Blackstone, KKR, and the larger institutions who are in the headlines do. Show them that you know what you know really well by walking them through case studies or, giving a good anecdote or making a comparison to something that they're comfortable with. Make it real and tangible. The sponsors and operators who take the time to really lay that out in a clear and concise way, they forge long-lasting relationships that maybe won't result into an allocation in the first month. it never does that quickly, but it will over time, right? And again, I think it's just a paramount point. Most family offices want to invest with very sharp people.
Sure.
And you need to show that, right? You can't just say, "Hey, here's my teaser," show me why you're sharp. That's the whole idea.
Yeah. Well, love to double click on what you've seen with sixth gen, maybe even third to sixth gens in terms of how that's differed. There's been a pretty large real estate family office that came on our podcast I think maybe a month ago, and they hired somebody specifically to build a venture and alternatives portfolio. So that person was tasked with building out a program. So that person was, I think, just kind of hired externally,
Sure.
but essentially an extension of the family. And maybe the family or the principals were 100% focused on just the real estate and the family business, but they have interest in getting into other sectors because there's just other interesting opportunities, and sometimes you have to do that to kind of mitigate risk of the markets when it comes to your family's business. So what I've seen is managers is if you're a manager focused on AI, or if you're focused on cybersecurity, that family may not have any understanding of that industry, and they may not even be interested in it. But if it's interesting, you might pique the interest of that family. Maybe the family will eventually allocate, not only because they have a slight interest in the industry, but they might just like you as a person, and they may just see that entrepreneurial spirit in you, kind of similar to how they were, right, when they were building their business or their enterprise. So maybe they just may take a chance and back you. So I've seen that a few times where people have, built master classes, or they've had webinars, or people come in and, they see interesting people sign up. And then I've also seen some MFOs do some pretty interesting webinars to kind of, gain the interest of families through some type of tax strategy web. I've signed up for a few of those too. I thought it was pretty interesting. How do you think about, tax efficient, holding companies and
Yep.
structures? So there's been things that I've nerded out about that I typically don't allocate my time to, but I'm like, hey, I saw this in my feed. And then now we have programming and podcasts and short form content that can stay on the top of people's news feeds. So how is kind of maybe Gen 2 to Gen 6 kind of reacting to that differently versus the Gen 1s?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there with a couple things that you said. So I would say on the pure investing side, and getting into new asset classes, I mean, listen, I probably, in our age range, probably identify more fundamentally with, a Gen 3 or a Gen 4, what I would call the rising family office members, where
Sure.
they've grown up around this technology. They've seen things like Bitcoin and crypto and all this different new wave, asset classes or quasi asset classes, and they think that's exciting. The Gen 2, the Gen 1s who have made the money, have shepherded the capital through different storms, so to speak. They tend to have a realization that if they still have the operating company or a lot of the core assets, they think cash is king. Realistically, cash is always king, because if you don't have that, you can't make investments, right? And you do sometimes have this difference of opinions between a certain age group of the Gen 3 through 6 that they want to do things that are a little bit flashier. Doesn't mean that they're not great investment ideas, but it may not necessarily have an eye on, well, what is the realization of some of these gains actually, and what does that timeline look like? Because we might own, 6 or 7 different real estate assets that are covering the bills, but if we're not reinvesting those proceeds effectively, we can't necessarily do 7 venture deals with big checks that we're not going to monetize. One, if at all, just the realisticness of a venture, but then also, maybe in 10 years, right? And I think being disconnected from that initial liquidity event can sometimes cause a little bit of a haze on how the ultimate assets work together, right? Then I can go into a different part where, there's some families that they get calls all the time and they don't allocate at all. I think sometimes sponsors forget that family offices are not just set up to make investments. Family offices are set up to manage the affairs of the family. Sometimes they make investments, sometimes they don't. Sometimes all they do is make investments.
Sure.
So definitely, for an individual like myself, where my background is definitely migrated to extensive tax, exit, legal planning, um, showing families where you can create extra value beyond the investments, freeing up liquidity in ways that have never been properly explained to them, showing them what other families have done in similar situations to extract extra value out of their holdings. That's always helpful. Um, to the degree that, an advisor or a consultant can actually drill down into actual holdings or opcos that they have to show how they can generate more cash or more earnings, I think is always helpful. But you need to really have a good understanding, and whether you're a family member or inside the family, or outside the family as a consultant, just have a great understanding of what they're trying to achieve as the family dynamic. And then I think you can really start to build into, like that one family you mentioned, like they want to build a venture arm. Why are they building a venture arm? If they have big real estate holdings, are they trying to focus their venture on technology that helps improve the operational efficiencies of their real estate? I have one family that I've known for over a decade. They're in a technology space and they never did venture until somebody pitched them something for their opco, and they're like, "Oh, are you taking angel money?" And it was a vendor, and they're like, "Oh, never thought about it." He's like, "I'm going to give you a couple $1 million because if I need this product in my company, and I believe in it, and all my competitors need it." And that's just smart money, right? At the end of the day, he was already sold on the vendor relationship, but then he saw the bigger picture that everybody else in my industry is going to need this, so they're going to buy it. Why not make money off of that and help this guy scale too? So it really just kind of comes down to understanding what the family's end goal is. I mean, yes, obviously everyone's always trying to make great returns, but what do they define great returns as? And sometimes that great return could just be adding more value to the holdco. So that's one thing to kind of be cognizant of too.
Sure. Taking a step back on your career, because I think you walked us up to like the age of 24. Would love to continue the story and learn a little more about, your career in the legal industry, and then kind of how, and it looked like you were doing a lot of private equity transactional work. How did you pivot into kind of, much more private equity focused, opportunities? We started talking really deep on just financials of companies, and we, get companies to enterprise value, when we were chatting. So we'd love to hear kind of a little deeper, take on just kind of your career, and then kind of what you're doing now at your current firm, and how you're helping your clients.
Yeah, definitely. So, that inflection point, I was probably killing myself. I was working for a real estate fund manager. I was tasked with basically building out a single family office distribution capital markets group. It's meeting some really cool families. I was going to law school at night. Really no time for any kind of social life, but that was kind of my hustle, right? I knew it would kind of make sense at the end of the day. Ultimately ended up leaving that firm, just, kind of ran its course, and had an opportunity to work with one of my families who didn't really have any boots on the ground in a certain location they were at, and helped them with a workout. Really kind of knew nothing about the workout space. I just kind of knew that, I had the relationship with the family. They asked me who did we know that we could help. And then it kind of came down to the point was, well, can't you just do this? And I'm like, well, I can if you really want me to. It was really what it came down to. It was like, I can do attitude. And, we put together a solution with me and a couple of my partners, and we basically took something that would have been a complete negative on their balance sheet and made them a little bit of a profit, which at the end of the day probably looked like 100x to them, because people really don't like to lose money, right? They already kind of knew it was a sunk cost, so they threw a couple of dollars at this and said, let's see if we can figure it out, right? And that ultimately kind of launched me into more of the LBO, workout arena. That then kind of got me a couple referrals to some family offices who they wanted me to kind of come internally and build out, their stuff, for lack of a better word. We're having a big liquidity event. What do we've heard you're a solution oriented guy and you've got some really good ideas. Here's what we're trying to do. Which was some really cool learning experience as well too, because getting inside of a family office finally showed me how the true family dynamics worked. I mean, we were developing really cool luxury assets, and I think we mentioned one of the things we were working on was car washes. But we were using that at a time where it was very innovative in our structure for some tax depreciation strategies. Not stuff that I would necessarily pitch to anyone, but when you kind of looked at the holistic portfolio of the family's development, their rental income, and then what the bonus depreciation was doing through the car wash that they were putting into service, the net gain on the profits kept in the pocket year over year was probably better than anything any investment manager could have done in their heyday. And understanding that, sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating from like a fund manager to try to raise capital, because you're saying, oh, our returns are whatever 15, 18, 23%, and then you see the family where they're like, right, but our return net tax through our holdco is double that. Not to even embellish, like when you take into tax consideration. So it does get hard to kind of compare apples and oranges, just because two completely different things, and people are trying to maximize their profits. So after I did that, I took a brief stint of also managing some public money, kind of doing some fixed income asset management, some public equity value dividend investing, working with a number of my single family offices of just kind of building out bespoke products for them. And then really kind of, that kind of migrated and shifted into what I would call my slant on the multifamily office, where we're working with our clients essentially as their full-on C-suite, doing things that are very near and dear to them. Outside of investments, it's structuring their holding companies, it's helping them put in the right taxable entities, it's helping them transfer legacy wealth, it's helping them think about their assets differently. We work with some athletes where, they're always, for lack of a better word, hit up for money from their friends. It's like, well, what can we do with your money and your brand and your reputation? So yeah, we can always allocate, but, we also know a couple other people that can increase the revenues of this business tenfold. So let's be smart about this. So that's a big thing when we're looking for partners to work with, how to really just put our resources together properly. And, resources comes to, much more than just money, but really the core competencies are, at the truest sense, super advanced tax planning, restructuring, recalibrating, generating wealth, but not managing it, but necessarily just making sure everybody knows what they have and how to optimize those values. Right. And I think deals always come along, the right deals always get funded. I think, but the real reality is, providing clarity to a lot of the families that we work with, because they just don't know what's going on. I mean, I could go on for some different horror stories where some families thought that they were making money in companies, but it just looked like they were making money. When you kind of sit down and say, okay, here's how we put the whole picture together, then it starts to make a lot more sense. Then you uncover some problems and you're like, well, the problems are really just temporary. Now we know what solutions to put in place, and pretty soon you are making a lot more money. It just had to be structured properly. So there's a lot I could dive into, but the reality, it's really just kind of advanced tax planning, cash flow management, deal screening, deal structuring, quietly disposing of assets, just things that are very near and dear to the entrepreneur at the end of the day. And I work with a lot of first and second gen families, right? So it's a much different, let's call it, service offering than if you were, a sixth generation family who's been with, one of the larger, banking relationships for the last, 50, 60 years. Right. And they need to be treated differently too. So it's just, it's not a one size fits all type of situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for the audience, workout is essentially just a process of restructuring distrust companies' debt and operations. So some of the things that, I'm familiar with is just, just doing the whole debt restructuring, operational restructuring, whether it's cutting costs or, obviously increasing sales, but like you said, and then, possibly you could, alongside the debt restructure, maybe get some equity as well, or kind of do some negotiation with the creditors, and, essentially just trying to avoid bankruptcy so that hopefully they're in the green and they could, have some type of liquidity event where they can sell to, a larger conglomerate or, just a bigger PE shop that's just trying to add to their balance sheet. So I think those are some of my thoughts. But any other scenarios with essentially like a turnaround that a workout would be relevant, or just did I miss anything else in terms of?
I mean, the other thing I would say too is, I think there is a misconception that family offices have all their stuff together, their ducks in a row. So outside of the workout, restructuring is also something that's very important, right? So there was a situation where family was looking to sell a business and they really didn't have what I would call any type of formal tax counsel. And we're just sitting there, we're like, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to save X millions of dollars. And they're like, well, can't we just do this as is? And the answer was yes, we can. But if you take 30 to 60 days and do this, you save this much more money. And it involved doing a couple different entity switches and all stuff that, is very pretty standard, but they didn't have what I think is being, colloquially thrown around now. It's like that expert generalist in-house who could say this needs to be done a little bit differently to optimize family assets, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess to a degree that is what we do here. But I think that's a big thing where you can provide, again, a lot of extra value for the same transaction that needs to happen or wants to happen, but just by doing the right thing. I mean, it's not saying anything was done wrong. It's just being smarter about it. That's really what it kind of comes down to.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point. I mean, I think some people are just looking for a bigger picture of how to think about their strategy and just kind of a holistic plan. So I'd love to just kind of workshop a couple permutations of that, right? So we've seen, especially in my community, we have successful business families that have operating companies, but they're also allocating to venture. Maybe that's like a separate LLC. So I've seen that, and then I've seen people set up a formal single family office and kind of allocate out of that structure, and they'll build new strategies as they kind of evolve their knowledge of those sectors. But if you got a couple, and again, these could just be generic examples of just kind of a family. Hey, they've got, the principals that are kind of thinking about their holdings and how maybe they're investing in some real estate, they're investing in some public markets, private markets. And then there's some families that are like, look, we don't really know how to hire this stuff. And we also don't have the budget. So we're going to go out and get like an OCIO, right? Someone coming out externally, connecting all their accounts, coming up with like an aggregate plan and developing some type of holistic strategy. So again, you talk to one family, you've talked to one family, so everybody's got different problems and different goals, but maybe just a couple personas. I figured that'd be kind of fun to kind of workshop in terms of like a couple different sizes of families, couple families that come from different backgrounds or businesses. And again, these don't have to be real clients, but maybe just persona types.
Yeah, I mean, there's you've kind of got what I would say like the first example, which is like the embedded family office, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's a family that they've got their operating company, they're making, $10 to $30 million a year, if you will. They know they're eventually going to sell that business for a couple $100 million, but they've got their internal controls all kind of shared. Like their bookkeeper for the opco is also doing the bookkeeping for the family office. The CFO for the opco is also doing the financial analysis for their real estate acquisition. If this sounds sloppy to you in the audience, it's because it is, but it is also very common in the single family first generation space. That sometimes can be a difficult dynamic because if the family business has been business for a number of decades, transferring them to a better entity structure is challenging because you're going up against, well, this is how we've always done it. Let's not do it this way, right? But again, the value proposition would kind of be, okay, well, you wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't put a Hyundai in a garage where you keep your Ferraris, right? Like that's kind of ultimately, I think, a very simple anecdote. And kind of saying, well, if you're going to make a lot of real estate investments, let's start off a real estate holdco, because then you can kind of set up a legitimate property management company if that's something that you want to do. Otherwise, you can outsource it just fine with the best of them, but understand you need to have a certain amount of mass to get access to the better ones and make it worthwhile. If you want to do some venture investing, let's make sure that we've got the right entities again structured so you're not paying a stupid amount of capital gains in certain situations. We talk with them through, the qualified small business stock and how to maybe set that up across different individuals within the family, if we can do that in a series. So there's a lot of just different strategies that you can put together that can create a lot of value. And sometimes it's just saying, like, listen, here's what happens in your best case scenario. You sell something for $100 million. Here's your tax situation. If you do it in this situation, here's $100 million and here's how much more you make. That resonates a lot, right? So then all of a sudden they're like, oh, it's not really a problem, but I would like to keep more money. Right. And I would like to basically keep those after tax returns. I think that's a really good example when you're dealing with those first families. The second one is kind of like the newly liquid, right? I mean, they've just sold their business for a couple $100 million, maybe $1 billion. They maybe did the right planning with like an estate and a trust team, but they never really took the time to build out the infrastructure. And family offices have become very popular and mainstream in some kind of idea within, I'd say, like the last 5 to 10 years, even though it's been around since like the 1600s. But they want to have a family office. Like, they just sold their big business and now they want to be the new shiny new toy on, wherever they are. But educating them through what that actually means, right? And again, in some ways, if they've been allocating certain private deals, they're used to one exception and what their cost of capital is for investing. And now all of a sudden you're saying, well, do you want to do this with a full-on team? It's going to cost anywhere from $2 to $5 million for a typical SG&A, right? Then they have a heart attack because they're not making $25 million a year in EBITDA with their opco. And they're like, I can't do that. I'm like, well, then you have to go this OCIO model, right? Now, then you get into what I would call the hybrid, where some people are, well, can I just do the OCIO model for some stuff that I don't want to be as hands-on because I really want to get involved in real estate? Look, of course, but you need to have a plan. And it's just like anything where I think a lot of newer families forget that when they first started off, they had a strategic plan for building their business and scaling wealth and growing. You kind of need to do that again from the beginning. What is your vision for your family office? Do you want to leave a legacy? Do you want to maximize wealth? Do you just want to buy iconic assets? You need to kind of set, and then who's going to be the people to do that? Do you have the talented resources in-house? Sure. If you do, how do you augment it with an OCIO or other external advisors? And the other big issue is too, and I kind of counsel a lot of the families that I've worked with in the past, how much of that individual's time do you need? And is there good alignment there? Because you might say, oh, I'm working with the best lawyer in New York City or Los Angeles, and they've done everything for 40 years. I'm like, fantastic, but you're not their only client. It's just a reality. Now, you may not be able to afford them full time, but if you want somebody like them, let's have a conversation about getting somebody in-house on a manageable budget so you can get that full-time dedication if that's what you're desiring for the next 12, 24, 36 months. And that's not too dissimilar what you see in the CFO community, right? I've explained to people where there's different types of CFOs. There's CFOs who you're bootstrapping. There's CFOs who are helping you through your Series A and B rounds. There's CFOs who prepare you to go public. And then they're gone. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's a certain skill set. So those, I think, are the two archetypes that I deal with a lot. The other then side is, that fourth, fifth, sixth generation family that's been established. I know one of my great friends, they basically just manage the affairs. It's a large family. They've been an industrial family for generations, and they've got some cool dynamics. I mean, stuff that, if some of the younger generations want to buy a house, they don't give them the money, but they go through the process of getting what like a pre-qualification letter for their home, and then the family funds the loan based on those dynamics, right? Because that family idea is like, we want to be able to assist, but we want to keep the money in house. One of the big things that they also do is, they do their annual family meeting, which is very akin to a public company's, annual shareholder meeting. Some things that, sponsors and operators may not realize, but, some of these families are quite large, 3, 4, 500 people. So they rent out a hotel in a really nice place, and they talk about what's going on with the family holdings. And it's different, but for them, it's very normal because they've been doing it for generations. Guys like that, though, or families like that, I mean, they've got much different processes, much more institutional controls, and harder to access, harder to work with, maybe sometimes impossible to work with, because they have been working with the same managers for the last, 30, 40, 50 years, or they don't really want to take any more risks. So they just give capital to, the bigger banks of the world. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just like sometimes these families have amassed so much money that there's not really a need to take any more risk, so that becomes challenging too. So those are, I guess, probably like the three out there that I would say kind of when you're thinking about the family office community, are the different types to kind of be aware of.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. There's one more point I want to discuss as well. So, I just finished the book, which I highly recommend. Really enjoyed reading. It's called Die with Zero. It's by Bill Perkins. I think he's a hedge fund manager in Austin, and he talks about just thinking about how many more decades you have. He uses this app. I think the app is called the Countdown app, and it actually visualizes how many days you have left. And what's interesting about that point is if you're giving away your money, the best time to give that inheritance to your kids is, the prime time to use that money is in your 30s, right? They're not gonna use that money and enjoy it the most when they're in their 60s or 70s, right? So they're starting to come into their career. They're starting to think about their kids are building a family. So I thought that was a pretty interesting point, that the prime time to kind of use that inheritance is probably in your 30s to maybe late 40s to early 50s. But after that, it's just not the most desirable time to make use of that. And then his whole concept is, after you've taken care of all of your affairs, kind of made sure that everything is set up with your trust, and you've given away all of the money to your kids and taken care of everything, there's an amount of money that you actually need to retire. And what the book is saying is that it's actually lower than you really expect, in terms of your runway to be able to cover most of your expenses. And you want to be able to spend the most of that as you can, so that you can enjoy, life experiences. So just wanted to hear your reaction to that, and just maybe tie in a few examples that you have with just families and how they think about their second gens and kind of thinking about their planning. Because that's a huge theme that, we're cascading in this conversation. Just having a plan, if you're in your 50s, you got maybe like another 25, 30 years left, to kind of really think about your legacy. So how have you kind of tied in some of those conversations with planning around that?
So I love the Perkins comment, and I'm going to butcher it, but Warren Buffett had a kind of similar slang, but it was basically like, it's nice to have a lot of money, but you don't want to keep it around forever. It's basically like, waiting until you're 80 to start having sex. Sorry, that's a little callous, but Warren said it, not me. And the reality is, it's like, yeah, I mean, what is it? Pick a dollar, something, amount. I mean, what is the point of leaving $50 million to your grandkids when they're 65, when it could have helped them when they're 25 or 30 or 35 or what have you? I think the more intentional families realize how to kind of transfer that wealth for operative points. So funding college in its entirety, maybe doing a year abroad to fund that if they want to go experience the world. There's some unique things there. I have a family friend who I wouldn't necessarily call like a family office, so they probably are. The family basically allows the kids to borrow a certain amount of money to start a business, but they actually have to go through the process of giving the grandparents like a business plan and be like, they get the money as long as it's not crazy, but like they want them to go through that process. So I think, just being very intentional about what you're trying to do. I mean, I think that the big thing is also kind of like, now everybody's like, oh, like build your legacy and make sure you have your legacy. Your legacy as a family office doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, like I want to own an iconic building, or I want to build this. It could just be like doing well by your individual family members and making sure that they have the start that you didn't have, right? I mean, not everybody's built for the struggle of entrepreneurship. We could read as many of these books as, whatever the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers did, back in the 1800s, like I don't think anybody, wants to do that stuff nowadays, right? And you can only imagine. But I mean, I think the reality is, regardless of the wealth, it's just we are very human still. And like a lot of these families just want to do well by their family members and make sure that they're taken care of. So I think that's ultimately the planning purpose, where it's like, what are we doing here? I've worked with one family and they're like, well, I'm like, day one, who are we planning for? Who are the key members? What do we need to think about? And the patriarch was just flat out like, my kids have already gotten X, Y, and Z. They've got enough. I'm like, okay. So now he didn't know what he wanted to do with it afterwards, but the reality was he's like, they're good. By all counts, the kids are going to be fine. But, you still have to define what do you want to do with the rest of that capital, whether it is donating to charity, setting up a foundation. So it's a lot of interesting other potential problems that come up. But, I think also helping those family members define what it is and why and what that vision is every bit as just as important as when you go to start out a company too. Right. So it's like, now that you've got this wealth, what's the end result? It's not the worst thing dying with extra money, right? I mean, it's still going to somebody, but being able to kind of utilize that to get to what goals you want to see for yourself and your family members. I mean, I always say use it now. Why wait? You kind of get into the whole argument about, I'm not saying don't save for retirement, right? For normal under ultra high net worth folks, but the reality is like the dollar now is always going to be worth more today than it's going to be worth in 10 years.
Sure.
So even if you're like putting it away and putting in all these like tax advantage retirement accounts, it's like, well, in theory, if taxes keep going up, you're actually hurting yourself by saving in a 401k. Like, I don't care what your tax deferral rate is. Like, you're not going to make that money back up.
Sure.
Unless you invested in something really good now, or started a pet project, or began a charity event. So I think that's just showing like how that money today can really spur what you want to do in the next 5 to 10 years. As long as you have a plan, it's, you can't beat that.
Sure. Well, hey, this was amazing. Really appreciate all the wisdom. I'd love one final piece of advice. This could be from a mentor. It could be from a past experience that you had in your career. But, if you were to give us a piece of wisdom, what would you leave us with?
I would say in my younger years, I was working on a deal with a banker who was very prominent. And he just kind of looked at me and was like, you are at such an inflection point that you were so worried about doing the perfect deal that you forgot that you just needed to get a deal done.
Sure.
And then you were good. And it never really kind of clicked until maybe about 4 or 5 years after the point. But the reality was kind of just in simple terms, like, don't wait for the stars to align, because they're never going to. The reality is get going, because you as an individual, if you're 25 or 35 or even 45, you've got a lot of compounding interest in terms of time in years, right?
Yeah.
Not just as an investment. So the sooner you can get started doing what you love or what your ambition is, doesn't have to be perfect. Just get out and go.
Yeah.
That I think was something that always kind of stuck with me.
No, I totally agree with that. I think there's people that synthesize and analyze and they're paralyzed, right? And
the analysis by paralysis.
Yeah,
right?
and then just the deal never happens because it needs to be perfect. And then I think the other fork in that is people just believe in overnight success. But like in reality, everything is like going to the gym, right? I mean, you gotta to get those muscles to where they need to be, you got to go in the gym every day. And it might, an overnight success for many of these successful entrepreneurs is like 10 years, and people think that they just became successful immediately, but it's several years of time and refining that craft and whatever it is. So, but you got to go out there and do it. If you don't do it, then it never, the first steps never happen.
Yeah. I mean, listen, to your point, a lot of people, I think, always kind of see the end result. They never witness the struggle because they try to distance themselves from the struggle.
Sure.
So, but again, you got to put in the hours. That's it.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
This was great. I really appreciate you having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun. Well, thank you so much, Greg. And thanks for everybody else. And have an amazing day.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Joel.
All right. Take care.